a stormy night, a silent inn, and one guest who never woke up. Welcome to Dossier Mystères. I am your host, Longford. Tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Your comments bring these mysteries to life. Let's begin. The afternoon sun dappled through the elms of St. Mary Mead, throwing lazy patterns over the manicured lawn of the vicarage garden. It was the annual village fête, a proud local tradition involving sponge cakes, homemade jams, and fierce competition over who had grown the fattest marrow. Tables groaned under the weight of trifles and tarts, and the air was thick with laughter, gossip, and the faint hum of the brass band. At the heart of it all stood the Bluebell Inn, recently refurbished and newly managed by the charming yet mysterious Mr. Henry Denham, a man who had appeared in St. Mary Mead just 6 months prior and quickly become the talk of the village. He had an easy smile, a perfectly pressed waistcoat, and a vague past. Some said he'd worked in London's hotel trade. Others whispered that he'd been mixed up in something far less respectable. Whatever the truth, his establishment had become the preferred spot for quiet dinners and discreet conversations. That afternoon, the Fates festivities were to conclude with a toast, a gesture from Mr. Denham himself, thanking the villagers for their warm welcome and promising prosperity to come. Glasses clinked, the band paused, and laughter rang as the village raised their cups of sparkling cider. Then came the sound, a soft, choking gasp. Mr. Denham's face had gone terribly white. His hand trembled. The glass fell and shattered. He stumbled, clutching at the tablecloth, sending plates of scones tumbling to the grass. A moment later he collapsed entirely. There was a silence, a frozen, dreadful stillness, before Mrs. Bantry screamed, "Good heavens, he's dead!" The fate descended into chaos. Reverend Clement knelt beside the fallen man, while Dr. Haydock, red-faced and flustered, elbowed through the crowd. "Stand back, all of you. Give me room," he barked, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. Within minutes his diagnosis was grim. Mr. Denham had been poisoned. Whispers swirled like autumn leaves. Poisoned. At the fête? With all those people about, who could have done it? They say he was engaged to Miss Pamela Cartwright. Could it have been jealousy? Nonsense. She was devoted to him. Among the murmuring crowd, Miss Jane Marple stood quietly near the tea-stool, her knitting needles poised mid-air. She said nothing, but her pale blue eyes, kind, curious, and unsettlingly observant, swept over the scene. She noticed the untouched sandwich beside Mr. Denham's glass, the faint smudge of lipstick on the rim, and the curious expression of Mrs. Hartnell, who was watching rather too closely for comfort. As the police arrived, Inspector Craddock himself, summoned from Much Benham, Miss Marple slowly resumed her knitting. She had seen too many such scenes before. The pattern, she thought, was familiar. People are so very alike in their motives, however different they seem. And in a village like St. Mary Mead, no one's secrets stay buried forever. End of Part 1, The Hook. Next section, The Village Reacts. Gossip spreads like wildfire as Miss Marple quietly begins to listen. Would you like me to continue with Part 2? The Village Reacts? By the following morning, St. Mary Mead was a cauldron of whispers. The shocking death of Mr. Henry Denham had travelled from doorstep to doorstep, embroidered and exaggerated with each retelling until it became nearly unrecognizable. The postmistress, Mrs. Birch, confided to anyone who would listen that she had seen Mr. Denham arguing with a stranger outside the inn 2 days prior, though whether she truly had, or merely wished she had, was anyone's guess. At the grocer's, Mrs. Hartnell declared that she'd never trusted that man from the start, not with his slick manners and fancy cufflinks. By midday the tragedy had transformed from sudden death to deliberate murder in the eyes of nearly every villager. Miss Marple, as was her way, listened more than she spoke. She sat by the window of her neat little cottage, a pot of tea beside her, and the morning paper unopened, her mind sifting through the fragments of talk she'd gathered since dawn. What struck her wasn't what was said, but what wasn't. The villagers spoke endlessly of Mr. Denham's charm and mystery, yet none could name a single close friend of his. He was liked, certainly, but not trusted, not truly known. It was curious, Miss Marple thought, how a man might live among people for half a year and remain in essence a stranger. Around noon, there came a sharp knock at her door. Opening it, she found Inspector Craddock, tall, trim, and looking distinctly weary. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a word or two." "Of course, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "Do come in. I was just making another pot of tea, and I believe there's a bit of lemon drizzle left from the fete." Craddock smiled faintly, but accepted, seating himself by the hearth. He knew better than to refuse Miss Marple's hospitality. It was in such settings that she often said her most useful things. "We've confirmed it was poison," he said, taking off his hat. "Cyanide, likely ingested with the cider. We're tracing the source now. Someone must have slipped it into his glass, but with so many people about, it's a devil to say who." "Quite dreadful," Miss Marple murmured, pouring tea. "And yet so very bold. One would imagine a public fete rather an inconvenient place for such a deed. Unless," Craddock said grimly, "the murderer wanted everyone to see it happen." Miss Marple's eyes lifted, mild but sharp. "Yes, quite so. Theatricality can be a sort of disguise, don't you think? Everyone sees, and therefore no one truly observes." The inspector sighed. "I dare say you're right, as usual. We've a list of names, those nearest him at the moment of the toast. Miss Pamela Cartwright, of course, Dr. Haydock, the Reverend Clement and Mrs. Bantry, and Mrs. Hartnell, who claims she was directly opposite him." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Dear Mrs. Hartnell, she does like to be at the centre of things, doesn't she? But tell me, Inspector, has Miss Cartwright spoken much?" "Not a word since last night," he said. "We've had the doctor give her something to sleep. Poor girl was near hysterics. They were engaged, you know." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "so I have heard, though one wonders if it was quite as harmonious as it appeared. I've often thought Miss Cartwright rather high-strung, sensitive to slights others might not notice." The inspector looked thoughtful. "You think she had cause?" "Oh, my dear Craddock, I think we must consider that everyone has cause of some sort. It is merely a matter of scale and opportunity." When he departed, Miss Marple sat for a long while watching the smoke curl from the teapot. Her thoughts returned to the fete, to that single curious moment before the collapse. Mrs. Hartnell's eyes, narrow, assessing, almost satisfied. The lipstick on the glass, faint but telling, and that untouched sandwich, lying beside it as if someone had carefully avoided touching it. It was all very strange. By afternoon, Miss Marple decided to take her customary walk. She passed the inn, now shuttered and silent, a policeman stationed by the door. The Bluebell had never looked so forlorn. Across the street, the Reverend's wife was speaking animatedly to Mrs. Price Ridley, both women lowering their voices when Miss Marple approached. She smiled, nodded politely, and continued on. At the corner she encountered young Tommy Briggs, the errand boy from the grocer's, who was idling with his bicycle. "Good afternoon, Tommy," she greeted. "I suppose you've had quite a busy day." He grinned sheepishly. "Yes, miss. Everyone's been sending for things since last night. All in a panic, they are. You'd think poison might come through the post." Miss Marple chuckled. "Perhaps it does, in a way. Tell me, Tommy, when you were at the fete, did you happen to notice who poured the cider for Mr. Denham?" Tommy blinked. "Well, yes, I think it was Miss Cartwright. She was behind the table, helping Mrs. Bantry serve it. I saw her hand him the glass, I'm sure." "Thank you, dear boy," said Miss Marple warmly. "They have been most helpful." As she walked home, the late afternoon sun glinting off the church spire, Miss Marple reflected on the delicate patterns of human behaviour. People, she thought, were like bits of knitting, interwoven, sometimes tangled, but never without design. The trick was to see where the thread began to twist. And in this case, she suspected, it had begun long before the fete. The following morning dawned misty and pale, the kind of English morning that muffled sound and made every corner of St. Mary Mead feel a little too quiet. Miss Marple was already awake, her tea cooling beside her as she sat knitting by the window. Her mind turned over the same facts again and again, each thread tugging at another. A man was dead, poisoned in plain sight. His fiancée had handed him the fatal glass. And yet, Miss Marple thought, there was something too simple about that. Crimes of passion were rarely performed before an audience. Those who killed for love or hate tended to choose shadows over sunlight. A knock sounded at the door, brisk and impatient. She rose and opened it to find Mrs. Bantry, cheeks flushed and eyes bright with gossip. "Jane, have you heard? They've taken poor Pamela in for questioning." Imagine the police thinking that sweet girl capable of murder. Miss Marple motioned her in, though her expression remained calm. "Do sit down, Dolly. I imagine the inspector is only being thorough. Appearances can be misleading, as you know." "Misleading? My dear Jane, I dare say you're right. Still, people are talking. Some say Pamela and Henry quarreled the day before the fete. About money, of all things. I heard from Mrs. Price Ridley that Pamela wanted to invest in the inn and he refused her. Quite the scandal, if true." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "Money often makes the most loyal of hearts waver. But tell me, my dear, have you noticed anything odd since the fete? Any behavior out of the ordinary?" Mrs. Bantry pursed her lips in thought. "Well, Mrs. Hartnell has been remarkably quiet. You know how she usually thrives on calamity. But she's hardly been seen since that dreadful day. And the doctor, Dr. Haydock, he looked terribly agitated when I saw him at the chemist's yesterday. Wouldn't meet my eye." Miss Marple's gaze flickered with interest. "The doctor, you say? How curious. He's not a man easily unsettled." After Mrs. Bantry had gone, Miss Marple took her coat and set out toward the high street. The village was alive with speculation. Clusters of villagers whispering outside the bakery, the faint ring of the post office bell, and the distant toll of the church clock. She nodded politely at each passer-by, but paused only when she reached the chemist's shop. Inside, the air smelled of camphor and soap, and behind the counter, Mr. Pritchard was measuring out powders with his usual solemnity. "Good morning, Mr. Pritchard," Miss Marple greeted kindly. "I was hoping to inquire after Dr. Haydock. I understand he's been rather busy these past days." Mr. Pritchard gave a cautious look. "Busy, yes. Distracted, too. Came in yesterday asking for something. Arsenic antidote, if you can believe it. Said it was for a patient's dog. But between you and me, Miss Marple, he looked as though he were the one in need of it." "Indeed," she murmured, her expression giving nothing away. "One forgets sometimes that doctors have their own nerves to mind." From the chemist's, she made her way to the Bluebell Inn. It remained shuttered, guarded by a solitary constable who greeted her respectfully. "No entry, Miss Marple. Inspector's orders." "I quite understand," she said. "I merely wondered if the inspector had left word about when the premises might reopen." "Not until the coroner's inquest, ma'am," he said. "Tomorrow afternoon, at the village hall." Miss Marple thanked him and turned to go, but as she did, her eye caught something glinting faintly in the gutter beside the inn's entrance, a small silver object, half hidden beneath a scrap of paper. She stooped and retrieved it, holding it delicately between two fingers. It was a cuff-link, oval-shaped, engraved with an elaborate initial, H.D. "Well now," she murmured to herself. "That's rather odd. Our Mr. Denham, I fancy, was wearing a full pair when he toasted the village." She slipped it into her handbag and continued home, her thoughts tightening like a net. That evening, as twilight deepened and lamps flickered to life along the street, Inspector Craddock returned to see her. He looked weary, his expression grim. "It's a mess, Miss Marple. The press will have it soon. We've confirmed the poison came from the bottle of cider served at the fete, but only Mr. Denham's glass was affected. Someone tampered with it beforehand." Miss Marple poured tea without hurry. "And you believe Miss Cartwright to have done it?" He hesitated. She served the glass. We found traces of cyanide on the inner rim of her gloves. That's hard to ignore. Perhaps, Miss Marple said mildly, but one should never be too hasty about gloves. They're so very easy to borrow or to plant. Craddock sighed. You always think of the one thing we've overlooked. I do try, she replied with a faint smile. Tell me, did you happen to find both of Mr. Denham's cufflinks? He blinked. His cufflinks? No, can't say we did. Why? Oh, no reason at all, she said innocently. I merely noticed his sleeves looked uneven that afternoon. It struck me as peculiar. Men can be so careless about symmetry, don't you think? Craddock frowned, clearly uncertain whether she was teasing him or not. You've got something in mind, Miss Marple. I can tell, she smiled faintly. Perhaps only a feeling. You see, Inspector, I've always believed that in matters of crime, the smallest things, the ones everyone overlooks, are the most revealing. After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly, the firelight casting long shadows across her sitting room. She took out the cufflink and turned it over in her hand, tracing the engraving with one delicate finger. It gleamed faintly in the lamplight, catching the fire's glow, a symbol of vanity, perhaps, or of something much darker. Outside, the mist thickened once more over St. Mary Mead. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, and as the sound faded, Miss Marple's thoughts settled into a quiet certainty. The truth of the matter was close at hand, but the killer, she suspected, was closer still. The morning of the inquest dawned grey and drizzling, a soft rain that slicked the cobblestones and cast the village in a sombre hush. Miss Marple stood by her window once more, the single cufflink resting on the table beside her teacup. It caught the light even in the dull weather, a small glinting reminder that something or someone was still out of place. She thought about Inspector Craddock's tired eyes, about Pamela Cartwright's pale, frightened face, as described by Mrs. Bantry, and about the curious stillness surrounding Mrs. Hartnell. It was a pattern forming slowly, as knitting does, one stitch at a time. By mid-morning, the village hall was crowded. The air smelled faintly of damp wool and polished wood. The coroner presided at the front, and the villagers filled every bench and corner, their voices kept low, though their curiosity was not. Miss Marple took a modest seat near the back, her hat neat, her gloves folded in her lap. She watched closely as each witness took the stand. Dr. Haydock was the first. His tone was professional, but his eyes betrayed unease. Mr. Denham's cause of death, he said, was cyanide poisoning administered orally. Death was nearly instantaneous. When asked about the source, he hesitated, glancing toward the inspector. I can only say the poison was present in the cider Mr. Denham drank. How it came there I cannot tell. Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his hands. He was a good man, Dr. Haydock, but not immune to fear. Fear of guilt, perhaps, or fear of what he might know. Next came Miss Pamela Cartwright. She looked fragile, dressed in mourning black, though the engagement had not yet turned to marriage. Her voice trembled as she answered questions. Yes, I poured the cider. Mrs. Bantry asked me to help. There were many glasses all lined up together. I handed one to Henry, Mr. Denham. I didn't notice anything strange. The coroner leaned forward. You were seen arguing with Mr. Denham the day before his death. Is that correct? Pamela's face went white. We disagreed about the inn, yes, but it was nothing serious. He said he needed more money, that some of his business partners were pressing him. I offered to help, but he refused. A murmur ran through the room. Miss Marple caught the faintest flicker of reaction from Mrs. Hartnell, sitting stiffly near the aisle, her gloved hands clasped too tightly in her lap. The woman's expression was composed, but her eyes darted briefly toward Pamela, then to the inspector. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple had learned that guilt rarely made grand gestures. It preferred to hide behind glances. When the inquest adjourned, the verdict was as expected: death by poisoning, administered by person or persons unknown. The crowd spilled out into the rain, murmuring their theories, their umbrellas bobbing like dark flowers. Miss Marple, however, lingered behind, speaking softly to Inspector Craddock as he gathered his notes. "A very distressing business," she said. Poor Miss Cartwright looked quite undone. "She's not telling us everything," Craddock muttered. "That man Denham, he was in debt, deeply. The inn renovations cost more than he claimed. He borrowed from someone, but we've yet to find who." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I think you will, Inspector. Debts are rather like sins. They have a way of showing up eventually." Outside, she walked slowly through the drizzle toward the churchyard, where the headstones stood like silent witnesses. Her thoughts returned to that cufflink. The initials were clear enough, H.D., but the style was not London-made. She had an eye for such details. It looked continental, something one might purchase abroad. And if Mr. Denham's business was so pressing, what was he doing with fine silver imported from Italy? Passing the post office, she spotted young Tommy Briggs again, this time delivering telegrams. "Good afternoon, Tommy," she said cheerfully. "Working hard, I see." "Yes, miss," he replied, adjusting his cap. "Had a busy morning. One of the telegrams was for Dr. Haydock from London. Looked important. From London, you say?" Her eyes softened. "How interesting." "Thank you, Tommy. You're quite the observant young man." When she returned home, she found Mrs. Bantry waiting in her parlour, looking unusually agitated. "Jane, I've just come from the vicarage." "You'll never guess." Mrs. Hartnell fainted during tea, said she'd been feeling poorly since the inquest. "The doctor was sent for, and you'll never believe it. He refused to see her. Said he wasn't well himself and sent word for a substitute from Much Benham." Miss Marple poured her friend a cup of tea, her expression thoughtful. "Refused, did he? That's unlike Dr. Haydock. He's not one to shirk his duty. I wonder what could possibly distress him so." Dolly Bantry leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "You don't suppose he's hiding something?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, we are all hiding something. The question is whether it's important." That night, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the rain pattering steadily against the window. She laid the cufflink on the table once more, and beside it placed a small scrap of paper she had found in her handbag. A bit she must have unknowingly picked up from the gutter when retrieving the cufflink. Now under the lamplight she saw faint writing on it. "Tuesday 3:15, Bluebell Cellar." Her brows lifted slightly. A meeting, perhaps, or a delivery. Either way, the time was past, but the message remained, a clue left behind by accident or by fate. She folded the note neatly and tucked it away, her mind already arranging tomorrow's errands with deceptive simplicity. A call to the doctor, perhaps, a word with Mrs. Hartnell, and later a quiet visit to the Bluebell Inn itself. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her knitting lying forgotten in her lap. People, she thought, always revealed more than they intended, especially when they thought no one was watching. And Miss Marple, as ever, was watching. The following day broke bright but cold. The rain swept clean from the air and replaced by a hard, silvery light that made every rooftop glisten. Miss Marple rose early, her mind already fixed on the matter of the note and the curious coincidence of Dr. Haydock's sudden indisposition. She had always believed that human behavior, like a well-stitched seam, revealed its flaws under strain, and there was something frayed indeed about the good doctor's composure. After a modest breakfast, she wrapped herself in her shawl and set out toward the vicarage, where she knew Mrs. Bantry would be waiting to pour out the morning's news. She didn't have to wait long. Mrs. Bantry opened the door before Miss Marple could even knock. "Jane, you'll never believe what's happened. Mrs. Hartnell's taken herself off to her sister's in Little Mayfield. Not a word to anyone, just gone in the night. The maid said she packed a single case and took the first bus out." Miss Marple stepped inside, unruffled. "How curious," she said softly. "And after fainting only yesterday. People often recover quickly when fright rather than illness is the cause." Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously. "Exactly what I thought. And the inspector is beside himself. Says she was due to be questioned again about that business with the glass." "Ah, yes, the glass. murmured Miss Marple, taking a seat by the window. "Such a small thing, yet so easily switched. I dare say Mrs. Hartnell would have known where the serving table stood. She's organized the fete for years." The two women exchanged a glance, and for once Mrs. Bantry had no quick reply. The clock ticked softly between them, the village sounds drifting faintly through the panes, cartwheels, a barking dog, the distant ring of the church bell. By late morning, Miss Marple made her way to the Bluebell Inn. The constable at the door looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight as she approached. "Inspector Craddock's inside, Miss Marple. But I'm afraid, well, he said no one's to disturb him." "Of course," she said pleasantly. "But perhaps you might tell him that an old woman with a fondness for cider wishes to ask him about cellars." The constable blinked, then disappeared inside. Within moments Craddock emerged, looking exasperated but faintly amused. "You do have a way of getting past my orders, Miss Marple." "I've always found politeness to be most effective," she said, smiling. "Now, if you'll indulge me, I'm rather curious about the Bluebell cellar. I believe something of importance may be found there." He frowned but gestured for her to follow. The two descended into the cool, dimly lit space below the inn, where rows of cider barrels lined the walls, and the faint tang of apples and dust hung in the air. Craddock motioned to a crate near the far corner. "We've already searched the place. Found nothing but empty bottles and storage ledgers." Miss Marple's eyes roamed over the room, sharp and restless. She stopped near a stack of crates and bent to retrieve a small fragment of glass glinting near the floorboards. "Curious," she murmured. "This doesn't look like cider glass. More like, oh dear, perhaps a small vial. Medicine bottle, wouldn't you say?" Craddock crouched beside her. "Could be. And there's residue inside." "I'll have it tested." "Do," she said, "though I expect you'll find traces of something far less medicinal than aspirin. Cyanide, perhaps, or a compound like it. And if I may guess further, I should think it came from Dr. Haydock's practice." Craddock stared at her. "You think the doctor supplied the poison?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not intentionally, my dear Inspector. But bottles can go missing, especially when a man is careless, or when someone close to him knows where he keeps his keys." He straightened, thoughtful. "You're suggesting theft. Merely observation," she said with mildness. "Doctors keep many dangerous things in their cabinets. Servants, too, are often underestimated in such matters. Who cleans his surgery, I wonder?" Craddock rubbed his chin. "A woman named Clara Sims. Quiet sort, widowed, been with him for years. You think she's involved?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that quiet people see far more than they're given credit for." They left the cellar and stepped back into the crisp daylight. As they parted ways, Miss Marple walked slowly toward the green, her thoughts circling around the doctor, Mrs. Hartnell, and that peculiar note. There was a thread linking them all, she was certain, a pattern forming beneath the surface. That afternoon, she paid a visit to Dr. Haydock's surgery, under the pretext of asking after Mrs. Hartnell's health. The doctor looked gaunt and unshaven, his usual briskness replaced by fatigue. "I'm afraid Mrs. Hartnell hasn't been my patient since yesterday," he said tersely. "She left the village rather suddenly." "So I've heard," said Miss Marple mildly. "It must be a great strain, these recent events. And to think, such a dreadful poison right here among us." He flinched almost imperceptibly. "Yes, dreadful," he muttered. "But I assure you, Miss Marple, I keep my supplies under strict lock and key." "I never doubted it for a moment," she replied with gentle warmth, "though I imagine others might not be so conscientious. Servants, for example, can be easily persuaded if the right story is told." Dr. Haydock's gaze flickered, and in that fleeting moment Miss Marple saw guilt, or was it fear, flash in his eyes. But he recovered quickly, offering her a tight smile. "You needn't worry, Miss Marple. I've already checked my stock. Nothing's missing." She nodded, thanked him, and left, though her mind was humming with quiet certainty. "Nothing missing," he had said. Yet his hands had trembled, his voice faltered. Something was missing, she felt sure. If not from his cabinet, then from his conscience. That evening, as dusk settled and the lamps flickered in cottage windows, Miss Marple sat by her fire once again. The cufflink still lay beside her, polished now to a dull gleam. She considered its presence, the note, the doctor's agitation, and the vanishing of Mrs. Hartnell. Each clue was a puzzle piece, and the picture they formed was beginning to take shape. She reached for her knitting, her expression serene. The next move, she knew, would reveal much. A visit to Little Mayfield, perhaps, or a small test for Dr. Haydock's nerves, because, as Miss Marple often reminded herself, the truth always trembled before it broke. The next morning a pale frost lay over the fields, and the air carried the sharp bite of early winter. Miss Marple rose before dawn, her mind alive with quiet purpose. The village was stirring slowly, smoke curling from chimneys, the milk cart rattling down the lane. She dressed with care, pinned her hat neatly, and slipped the small note and the silver cufflink into her handbag. There was work yet to be done, and she intended to begin where the threads converged, at the heart of the village's unease. At 9:30, she stopped by the post office, where Mrs. Birch was sorting letters with her usual briskness. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said cheerily, though her eyes shone with curiosity. "You'll have heard the latest, I suppose." "About Dr. Haydock's housekeeper?" Miss Marple's tone was mild. "Why, no. Has something happened?" Mrs. Birch lowered her voice. "Vanished last night. Clara Sims, gone without a word. Left her apron folded on the kitchen chair, can you imagine? They say she took the late train out of Much Benham, though no one's certain where she went." "How peculiar," murmured Miss Marple. "I do hope she's quite safe." She thanked Mrs. Birch, then continued toward the High Street. The news confirmed what she had suspected. Guilt was spreading like ripples on water, and those who knew the truth were beginning to flee its center. But Miss Marple had no intention of chasing shadows. Instead, she turned her steps toward the vicarage, where she knew the Reverend Clement's steady reason might illuminate what emotion obscured. The vicar received her kindly, though concern was etched across his features. "It's an unhappy business, Miss Marple. The village feels quite unsettled. I can't recall such tension since the war. The doctor hasn't been to service, and Mrs. Bantry tells me you suspect something's amiss." "I suspect," she replied gently, "that there are too many secrets and too few truths. But I believe the matter will soon make itself clear. People can only hold their breath so long before something breaks." The vicar nodded gravely. "You have a gift for seeing what others overlook. If you need any help—" "Thank you, dear Reverend, but I think this particular puzzle requires only observation and patience, both of which you know I've had a good deal of practice with." Leaving the vicarage, she walked toward the lane leading out of St. Mary Mead. The road to Little Mayfield wound through hedgerows glistening with dew. She did not plan to travel the full distance herself. She had, after all, made arrangements the evening before. At the bus stop, she found Tommy Briggs waiting, his bicycle propped nearby. "Tommy," she said, "I wonder if I might ask a small favor. I need this note delivered to Mrs. Hartnell's sister, Mrs. Waring in Little Mayfield. It's quite important that it reaches her today." The boy's eyes widened. "Of course, miss. I'll take it straight away. Good lad. And perhaps when you return, you might notice if Mrs. Hartnell seemed herself, whether she looked troubled." He nodded solemnly and sped off, the wheels of his bicycle humming softly along the lane. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned back toward the village green. She met Inspector Craddock there by chance, or perhaps, as he suspected, not by chance at all. "Miss Marple," he greeted, removing his hat. "You've heard, I suppose?" "Haydock's housekeeper's disappeared." "Yes, such an odd thing," she said. "People seem to be vanishing all over the place. I was wondering, Inspector, have you had any word from the laboratory about that vial from the cellar?" Craddock frowned. "Yes, just this morning. It contained traces of cyanide, same compound found in Denham's glass." "You were right again." She inclined her head modestly. "Oh, I merely noticed what others overlooked. You see, I've been thinking about our late Mr. Denham, a man with debts, a past unknown, and, if I may say so, a certain talent for charming those he wished to use. I rather suspect he was not entirely honest about his dealings. You think the motive was money?" "I think," said Miss Marple softly, "the motive was desperation. And not only his." They walked together toward the inn, where a cold wind stirred the empty signboard. Craddock stopped at the threshold. "You believe Mrs. Hartnell's flight is connected?" "Oh, undoubtedly," she replied. "Whether she ran out of fear or guilt, I cannot yet say. But fear, Inspector, has its own scent. It clings to the edges of truth like smoke after a fire. That afternoon Tommy returned, flushed and windblown. He handed Miss Marple a folded note. "From Mrs. Waring, ma'am. She said to thank you kindly, and that her sister wasn't with her at all. She hasn't seen her in months." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "How very enlightening," she murmured. "Thank you, Tommy. You've done splendidly." She gave him a coin for his trouble and sent him on his way. As evening fell, she sat once more by her fire, her knitting untouched in her lap. The cuff-link gleamed faintly in the hearth's glow. She now saw what she had missed before. The engraving was not HD as she had first assumed. The ornate design had entwined letters, DH. The realization settled over her like a chill. Denham's initials reversed, or perhaps someone else's entirely. Dr. Haydock. Her eyes narrowed slightly as the pieces began to slide into place. The poison from his practice, the missing housekeeper, the doctor's agitation, the cuff-link in the cellar where the vial had been found. He had reason to fear exposure, but what had truly bound him to Denham? Blackmail, perhaps, or a secret debt of his own. Miss Marple rose, her movements calm and deliberate. She would not confront him outright, not yet. Truth, like knitting, must be drawn tight stitch by stitch. Tomorrow, she decided, she would visit the doctor again, but this time not as a patient or a friend. This time, she would watch for the tremor behind his practiced calm, and when it came, she would know how near she was to the heart of the murder. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters of the quiet village. In the dark beyond her window, St. Mary Mead seemed to hold its breath once more. The morning sun filtered weakly through the curtains, and Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, the faint scent of lavender polish lingering in the air. Her pen hovered above a sheet of notepaper, though she had written nothing. Instead, her thoughts lingered on the image of the cuff-link glinting in the firelight, the entwined letters DH, and all that it might imply. A simple ornament, yet one that shifted the entire shape of the puzzle. If it truly belonged to Dr. Haydock, then everything else, the vial, the missing housekeeper, the doctor's nervousness, fell into dreadful alignment. And yet Miss Marple's instinct whispered caution. Appearances deceived. They always did. It was not in her nature to condemn without certainty. A knock came at the door, sharp but hesitant. When she opened it, Inspector Craddock stood there, hat in hand, his expression troubled. "Forgive the early call, Miss Marple. There's been another development." "Do come in," she said, stepping aside. "I look as though you haven't slept." He managed a grim smile. "Not much. We found Clara Sims, the doctor's housekeeper, this morning. She turned up at a boarding house in Much Benham, dead. The landlady said she seemed ill when she arrived, but by dawn she was gone. Doctor says poison. Cyanide again." Miss Marple's eyes darkened with quiet sorrow. Poor woman. "A conscience can be a heavier burden than any sin." Craddock exhaled. "We searched her things. There was a note, unsigned but unmistakable. It's no use hiding the truth. He made me do it. We'll have it examined, of course, but it doesn't take much to guess who he might be." "Dr. Haydock," murmured Miss Marple, though not as a statement. "It would seem so convenient, wouldn't it?" Craddock frowned. "Convenient?" "My dear Inspector," she said gently, "I've lived long enough to know that guilt rarely presents itself so neatly. When evidence seems too perfect, it often means someone has been arranging it very carefully indeed." He looked at her sharply. You think he's being framed? I think, said Miss Marple softly, that someone understands human weakness far too well. If Dr. Haydock was being blackmailed, as I suspect, he would have behaved exactly as we've seen. Nervous, evasive, even frightened. But fear doesn't make a murderer. It makes a victim. Craddock sat forward. Then who, Miss Marple? Who would go to such lengths? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rose and crossed to the window, gazing out at the village green, washed clean by morning dew. Children were walking to school, their laughter distant but bright, a strange contrast to the shadow that hung over St. Mary Mead. The poison was prepared with precision, she said at last. The cider tampered with before the fete began. That suggests access, forethought, and a certain boldness. Mrs. Hartnell had all three. He blinked. You think she killed Denham? I think she feared him, said Miss Marple. He knew something about her, something from years ago. He had a talent for uncovering people's weaknesses and turning them to profit. Blackmail is a cruel art, Inspector, and one that thrives in quiet places where reputations matter more than truth. Craddock rubbed his temple. But Mrs. Hartnell's gone. Disappeared the night before the inquest. We've circulated her description, but there's been no sign. She won't have gone far, Miss Marple said calmly. People rarely do when they believe they can still control the story. She'll wait, watching to see how events unfold. And when she believes suspicion has settled elsewhere, perhaps upon poor Dr. Haydock, she'll return. Guilt makes people predictable, Inspector. It robs them of imagination. Craddock studied her with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. You make it sound almost inevitable. In human nature, she said quietly. Very little is accidental. That afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village, pausing here and there to exchange pleasantries. At the grocer's, she overheard Mrs. Price Ridley remark that Mrs. Hartnell's cottage had been seen with a light burning late the previous night. Probably burglars, the woman said airily. Or ghosts. I wouldn't go near that place after dark. Miss Marple smiled faintly, thanked her and continued on her way. But her mind was already working. A light in an empty house? That was no ghost, it was opportunity. At dusk she found Inspector Craddock again. I think, she told him softly, we should pay a call to Mrs. Hartnell's cottage. Quietly, if you please. The two approached the house under cover of twilight, the garden overgrown and the gate creaking faintly in the cold air. A single window on the ground floor glowed faintly. Craddock signalled his constable to stay back and tried the front door. It was unlocked. They entered silently, the faint smell of dust and stale perfume lingering in the hall. A sound from the sitting room made them both pause, a rustle, followed by the soft clink of glass. Craddock stepped forward quickly, and the beam of his torch cut through the dark. Mrs. Hartnell stood by the hearth, pale and trembling, her suitcase half packed beside her. Inspector, she stammered, I was only planning another journey. Craddock said grimly. She gave a strangled cry, her composure shattering. I had no choice. He was going to ruin me. He knew about my husband, about the money. I only meant to frighten him. I didn't know it would kill him. Miss Marple's voice, calm as ever, broke the silence. You put the poison in his glass yourself, didn't you? During the preparations for the toast. Mrs. Hartnell sank into a chair, covering her face. I couldn't bear it any longer. He said he'd tell everyone, that my husband's death wasn't as it seemed, that I'd driven him to it. He laughed, that horrible man. I wanted to stop him, that's all. Just stop him talking. Craddock nodded to his constable, who stepped forward quietly. We'll have to take you in, ma'am. As they led her away, Mrs. Hartnell glanced once at Miss Marple, eyes filled with despair. How did you know? She whispered. Miss Marple's answer was gentle. Because you stopped attending your knitting circle, my dear. And people only stop their routines when something inside them is already unravelling. Later, when the house was empty once more, Miss Marple stood by the fire, watching the flames dance. The truth at last had come to light. not through cunning or cruelty, but through the small, simple patterns of human weakness she knew so well. And though St. Mary Mead would soon settle back into its tranquil rhythm, she knew the calm would never quite feel the same again. The following days passed in a quiet haze, as if the village itself were trying to breathe again after holding its breath too long. The Bluebell Inn remained shuttered, the laughter and music of the fete now a ghostly echo in everyone's mind. Mrs. Hartnell's confession had satisfied the coroner and the papers, but not Miss Marple. Though she smiled politely when neighbours spoke of the dreadful business finally being over, her thoughts remained unsettled. She had seen too many cases where guilt was worn like an ill-fitting coat, accepted perhaps, but not made to measure. Something about Mrs. Hartnell's story, for all its tears and trembling, didn't fit. It was too neat, too rehearsed. And though she had spoken of fear, her fear had seemed misplaced, not of exposure, but of someone still unseen. Miss Marple found herself walking to the churchyard that Sunday morning, her usual path of reflection. Frost clung to the gravestones, and the yew trees stood solemn and silent. The vicar's sermon was earnest but subdued, touching delicately on sin and forgiveness. When the congregation filed out, murmuring softly about mercy and justice, Miss Marple lingered near the back pew. Inspector Craddock joined her quietly. "I must thank you again, Miss Marple," he said. "Without your insight we might have missed the truth entirely. Mrs. Hartnell's confession, well, it closes the matter." Miss Marple looked up at him with her calm, pale eyes. "Perhaps it closes it, Inspector, but not neatly. You see, I've always found that the truth, when it's genuine, has a certain finality to it, like the last stitch in a seam. This, I think, still unravels a little when tugged." Craddock frowned. "You're not satisfied?" "I seldom am until everything aligns," she said gently. "Tell me, what became of Dr. Haydock?" "He's left the village for a time," Craddock replied. "Rest cure," his partner said. "The whole ordeal seems to have shaken him." "Yes," murmured Miss Marple. "I expect it did. And yet one wonders why a man so distressed by guilt would leave behind the one thing tying him to it." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "The cufflink, Inspector. The one we found in the cellar. You see, I've discovered something curious. It does not belong to the late Mr. Denham or to Dr. Haydock. I had it examined yesterday by Mr. Pritchard, the chemist's nephew, you know, quite the expert in metals. He tells me it was of a design sold only in one London shop, and in a limited run, to a gentleman by the name of Charles Denham." Craddock stared. "Charles Denham? The victim's brother?" "Indeed," she said softly. "A brother no one mentioned, because no one knew he'd been in St. Mary Mead." He took a slow breath. "You think the brother was here? But why hide it?" Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the church door, where sunlight fell in bright bands across the aisle. "Perhaps because he didn't wish to be known. Mr. Henry Denham, you see, had left a trail of discontent behind him. Money borrowed, hearts bruised, and one or two business partners ruined. His brother Charles had every reason to despise him, and perhaps the perfect opportunity to settle old accounts." Craddock shook his head. "But Mrs. Hartnell confessed. Why would she take the blame if she didn't do it?" "For protection," Miss Marple said simply. "Because she was being blackmailed even after the crime. I imagine someone had very persuasive evidence, letters, perhaps, or the threat of scandal. A desperate woman will say anything when she believes her confession might shield another or end her torment." Craddock rubbed his temple. "You think Charles Denham killed his brother, then blackmailed Mrs. Hartnell afterward to divert suspicion?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that he used her weakness as cleverly as he used his brother's vanity. Poison is a coward's weapon, Inspector. It requires calculation, not courage, and from what I've gathered, Charles Denham had both the opportunity and the disposition for such planning." Craddock straightened. "We'll need proof." "Proof will come," she said serenely. "In fact, I expect it will arrive quite soon." That afternoon, Miss Marple invited Dr. Haydock's young assistant, Mr. Jeffreys, to tea. A shy man, awkward with conversation, but fond of Miss Marple's scones, he brightened considerably when she inquired about his time at the surgery. "Terrible business," he said earnestly. "The doctor's been half himself. And then, before he left, there was that strange gentleman who came to see him. Said he was an old friend from London, but I could tell it wasn't friendly. There was shouting, well, more like hissing. And when the man left, the doctor looked white as paper." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Did you happen to catch the man's name?" "Only part of it," Jeffreys said, frowning. "Something like Denham." "Yes, that was it. He signed the visitor's book, but crossed it out straight after. I thought it odd." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "I imagine he did." When the young man had gone, she sat a long while, the tea growing cold before her. The final threads had begun to weave together. A brother consumed by hatred and envy, a woman ensnared by guilt and blackmail, a doctor used as an unwitting pawn. All of it wrapped neatly beneath the guise of a village tragedy. At dusk, as the lamplighter moved through the streets, Inspector Craddock arrived at her door once more. "You were right," he said quietly. "We've traced a ticket purchased in Much Benham under the name Charles Dempsey, same handwriting as on the brother's business records. He left for London the night of Mrs. Hartnell's confession." Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. "Then I suggest you hurry, Inspector. Murderers rarely travel light. They carry their guilt with them, and sometimes their evidence too." As the door closed behind him, Miss Marple returned to her armchair by the fire. The village outside was silent, its peace slowly returning. But she knew peace in St. Mary Mead was always fragile, balanced on the quiet deceit of ordinary souls. She took up her knitting, her fingers moving deftly, her eyes distant and thoughtful. Somewhere in London, justice would soon catch up to Charles Denham, and here in her small, unassuming cottage, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, knowing smile, for in the tapestry of human nature she had seen once again how every deceit, however cleverly spun, left a visible stitch undone. 2 days later, the Morning Post brought the final ripple of consequence to St. Mary Mead. The envelope was cream-coloured, the handwriting unfamiliar but deliberate. Miss Marple examined it over breakfast, her tea still steaming beside her, and noted the London postmark with quiet satisfaction. She slit it open neatly and drew out a folded sheet. Inside, in the crisp, restrained hand of Inspector Craddock, were just a few sentences confirming what she had expected all along. "Charles Denham, alias Dempsey, was arrested last night at Euston Station. He confessed to his brother's murder. The motive, as you suggested, was financial and personal vengeance. Your deductions were invaluable, Miss Marple. I'll call upon you when I return." Miss Marple set the letter down, her expression composed, though her eyes softened with a glint of melancholy. She had no joy in being right. Murder, even in its cleverest form, always left a residue of sadness behind, a sense that something ordinary had been corrupted. She looked out through the lace curtains toward the village green, where the frost was beginning to lift and the school children were laughing on their way to lessons. Life, as it always did, had resumed, yet beneath the calm surface she could still feel the faint tremor of unease. It would linger, as it always did, long after justice had been served. That afternoon brought Inspector Craddock himself to her, door hat in hand, coat still smelling faintly of railway smoke. He looked both weary and relieved. "It's over," he said as she ushered him into the sitting room. "You were right on every count. Charles Denham admitted everything, planned it meticulously. He'd followed his brother here under a false name intending to reclaim money he claimed had been stolen from their father's estate. When persuasion failed, he turned to poison. Afterward, he blackmailed Mrs. Hartnell to ensure his own protection. She was an easy target, already burdened by her past." Miss Marple poured the tea without comment, the china clinking softly. "And the doctor?" she asked. "Entirely exonerated," Craddock replied. He was horrified to learn his medicine cabinet had been tampered with. Denham admitted stealing the cyanide under the pretext of an old injury, said he knew enough chemistry to recognize the label. The man was devilishly precise. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "The truly dangerous ones often are." Craddock looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head in wonder. "I don't know how you do it, Miss Marple. Half the time I can barely see where you're headed until you've already arrived." "Oh, it isn't so mysterious," she replied with her faint, kindly smile. "It's only that people are very much alike, Inspector. The same fears, the same vanities, the same small cruelties dressed up as virtues. Once you've watched, enough of them really watched, you begin to see the pattern repeat itself." He gave a quiet laugh. "You make it sound simple. Nothing about human nature is simple," she said gently. "Only familiar." Craddock leaned back, sighing. "Well, you've saved me more than a little embarrassment, and perhaps a few innocent souls as well. Poor Mrs. Hartnell, she'll recover in time, I hope." "With rest and kindness, yes," Miss Marple replied. "She was frightened, you see, not only of exposure, but of being believed. There's a curious comfort in confession, even false ones. It gives people back a measure of control when they think they've lost it." He nodded slowly. "And Pamela Cartwright?" "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "that poor girl will bear the scars of this for a long while. But perhaps, in a way, she has been spared. She was in love with an illusion, not a man. Better, I think, to learn that now than after marriage." Craddock rose after tea, lingering for a moment at the door. "You know, Miss Marple, there's talk of retiring me to the city after this case. I suspect they think I've been shown up by a village spinster." She chuckled quietly. "Oh, I'm sure they think no such thing, but should they ever do so, you may comfort yourself with the knowledge that it takes far more humility to listen than to speak. And that, Inspector, is the beginning of wisdom." When he had gone, the cottage settled once more into stillness. The clock ticked gently. The fire whispered. Miss Marple sat a long time without knitting, her mind drifting not to crime or deduction, but to the fragile balance of good and evil that lay within every heart. It never ceased to fascinate her, how easily malice could masquerade as grievance, how quickly pride could curdle into vengeance. And yet, even in the aftermath of darkness, the village always mended itself, one kindness at a time. As twilight descended, she rose and opened the window, letting in the crisp evening air. Somewhere across the green a piano played a slow waltz, tentative but sweet. The Bluebell Inn would open again soon, she supposed, under new management. People would talk, as they always did, but the gossip would soften with time. Soon the fete would be remembered not for its tragedy, but for its roses, its laughter, and the way the brass band had played too loudly during the vicar's speech. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she drew the curtains closed. The world, she thought, was a peculiar tapestry, full of bright threads that sometimes tangled but never broke entirely. It was her quiet duty to untangle them when they did, not for glory but because she could not help herself. Curiosity was her only vice, and perhaps her greatest mercy. She set her knitting back on her lap, the familiar rhythm resuming in her hands. Outside, St. Mary Mead grew still again, cloaked in the soft calm of evening. The mystery was ended, the pattern complete. Yet as Miss Marple worked the final stitches of her wool, her eyes glimmered with that same keen light that had guided her all along, the knowing that somewhere, some day soon, another thread of human folly would unravel, and she would be there, as always, to weave it quietly back into place. The next morning dawned clear and brittle, sunlight washing the frost from the thatched roofs and scattering it like powdered glass across the lawns. Miss Marple woke earlier than usual, the echo of last night's thoughts still quietly stirring her mind. The village, she knew, would soon return to its ordinary rhythm. Letters to be posted, hens to be fed, the milkman whistling as he passed each gate. Yet even as she folded her bedspread with careful precision, she could not shake the faint, familiar sense that resolution was rarely the same thing as peace. Truth had a way of lingering long after justice had been done, like a faint perfume clinging to an empty room. By mid-morning she was visited by Mrs. Bantry, who entered the cottage in a gust of good cheer and gossip, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "Jane, my dear, I declare you must have the patience of a saint. Everyone's saying the whole dreadful affair is finally behind us. And the inspector, well, he's being positively lionized for his part in it. I told him, of course, that he couldn't have done it without you, but he just laughed and said you'd see right through the compliments anyway." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Inspector Craddock is far too kind, and I'm sure he's had enough of murders to last him a lifetime." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice, settling into the armchair by the fire. "Still, it's quite something, isn't it? To think all that time that man's brother was living among us, right under our noses. I don't suppose we ever really know the truth about people, do we?" "No," said Miss Marple softly. "I suppose we don't. Though sometimes we suspect more than we admit." Her friend gave a delighted shiver. "Oh, Jane, you always make me feel there's more to come. But truly, I'm glad it's over. Poor Mrs. Hartnell. I sent her some broth yesterday. She looked so terribly lost when I saw her at the chemist's." "Grief takes many forms," Miss Marple murmured, pouring tea. "Sometimes it isn't for what has happened, but for what might have been different." For a while they spoke of ordinary things, the weather, the vicar's new sermon series, the scandal of Mrs. Price Ridley's curtains being dyed the wrong shade of blue. When Mrs. Bantry finally left, the cottage grew still again, filled only with the ticking of the clock and the faint hiss of the fire. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair and let her thoughts settle into the calm she had earned. Yet somewhere deep within her mind she could still see the pattern of it all, how small lies had built upon one another, how kindnesses withheld had hardened into secrets, how envy and pride had twisted together until something deadly emerged. Late in the afternoon, the vicar himself stopped by, his face lined with concern. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple," he said, accepting the cup she offered. "You've done this village a service, though I dare say most don't realize it. The way you see into people, it's not unlike a sermon in itself, only far more effective." "Not at all," she said, with her characteristic modesty. "I simply pay attention. The rest follows of its own accord." The vicar smiled gently. "If only we all paid attention, there might be fewer sins to confess. But I must ask, do you ever tire of it, Jane? Of looking so closely at the darker side of human nature?" She hesitated, gazing into her tea. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But it's the same nature that gives us compassion, forgiveness, and love, isn't it? The dark and the light are very much the same cloth. We can't understand one without the other." He nodded thoughtfully. "Wise as ever. You know, I believe you see God's handiwork where others see only coincidence." Miss Marple gave a small laugh. "Oh, I wouldn't presume quite that much, Reverend. But I do think he must shake his head at us from time to time." After he departed, the sun had already begun to dip behind the trees. The light that filled her sitting room turned golden and soft, touching the lace curtains and the edge of her knitting basket. She picked up her needles and began to work again, the rhythmic motion soothing her thoughts. Each stitch fell perfectly into place, the pattern emerging in quiet order. A little cardigan for her niece's new baby, she reminded herself. Something warm and practical against the chill. Outside, she heard the faint sound of laughter drifting from the direction of the Bluebell Inn. They were preparing to reopen, she knew, under new management this time. There would be dancing again, music, the clinking of glasses. People would smile and say how strange it was, that life could go on so easily after such dreadful things. But Miss Marple understood that this was not carelessness. It was resilience. Villages like St. Mary Mead survived precisely because they forgot just enough to keep living, and remembered just enough never to repeat their mistakes. As evening deepened, she rose to draw the curtains. Across the green, the lamplighter was making his slow, deliberate way from post to post. The glow followed him like a trail of embers, softening the outlines of every cottage and hedge. Miss Marple watched for a moment, a faint smile touching her lips. The world, she thought, always found its way back to light. She turned back to the fire, its warmth flickering across her face. The story was over now. The murder solved, the guilty taken away, the innocent restored to some fragile peace. Yet even in the quiet, she knew there would always be another story waiting, another secret tucked beneath the gentle rhythm of village life. Human nature, after all, was endlessly inventive, and she, patient as ever, would be ready when the next thread began to unravel. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, folded her hands neatly in her lap, and allowed herself a small sigh of contentment. The clock struck the hour, steady, familiar, unhurried. Outside, the wind rustled softly through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of applewood smoke, and the whisper of laughter from the inn. Life, imperfect and eternal, moved gently onward through the village she loved. And Miss Marple, with her quiet understanding and her watchful eyes, sat by her fire and listened, just as she always had, and always would. Evening had settled softly over St. Mary Mead, the kind of tranquil dusk that seemed to wash the whole village clean of memory. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the distant toll of the church bell carried across the lanes. Miss Marple sat in her garden, a shawl around her shoulders, her teacup balanced neatly beside her. The case of the Bluebell Inn murder, as the papers had called it, had become little more than a whisper now, a cautionary tale that faded with each retelling. Yet in the quiet, Miss Marple's mind returned to it, not with unease, but with reflection. Every puzzle, she thought, left something behind, not a scar, but a lesson. She had attended the trial in London, sitting quietly at the back, unnoticed among the curious onlookers. Charles Denham, pale and composed, had admitted everything with the same calm precision that had guided his crime. His motive, though tangled in greed, had been fed by something deeper, a long-festering hatred for his brother's deceit. Henry had stolen not only money but reputation, leaving Charles to carry the ruin alone. When he learned his brother had prospered in St. Mary Mead, under a false veneer of respectability, the opportunity for revenge had become irresistible. The poison stolen from Dr. Haydock's cabinet had been the final act of a patient mind too long consumed by bitterness. In court, Miss Marple had watched him speak. His voice was even, his eyes clear, but there had been no remorse there, only a quiet satisfaction that the game at last had ended. He had thanked her in his own strange way before the judge passed sentence. "It took someone like you to see the truth," he had said. "My brother thought he could charm the world, but he could never charm human nature itself." She had inclined her head, neither pleased nor scornful, for she understood what he meant. He was wrong, of course. Evil was not in human nature, but in its distortion. Still, she pitied him as she pitied all those who mistook vengeance for justice. Now, in the soft glow of twilight, she thought of the others who had been drawn into the web. Dr. Haydock had returned to his practice, graver but steadier for it, his confidence restored by kindness more than exoneration. Mrs. Hartnell had gone to live with her sister, her health improving daily, though she wrote sometimes of the restless dreams that still woke her at night. Pamela Cartwright had left the village entirely, travelling to her aunt's in Devon. Perhaps Miss Marple hoped to find a gentler sort of love in time. Even Inspector Craddock had changed. His letters, arriving now and then from London, carried a new tone of humility beneath the humour. He had learned, she thought fondly, not just how to pursue evidence, but how to listen to silence. A breeze stirred the roses beside her, carrying the scent of damp earth and early evening dew. The garden was her sanctuary, the one place where she could let her thoughts rest without fear of unravelling another mystery. And yet, as she sipped her tea, she could not help smiling faintly to herself. St. Mary Mead was peaceful for now, but peace, she knew, was a delicate thing. People were endlessly inventive when it came to folly and deceit. It was the way of life, after all, that the same hands which tended gardens could sometimes sow darker seeds. The gate creaked softly behind her, and she turned to see Reverend Clement walking up the path, his hat in his hands and his face warmed by the fading light. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," she replied, gesturing to the chair beside her. "You've come just in time for the last of the tea. It's grown a little cold, but so have I." He smiled, settling down. "I thought I should thank you again. The village owes you more than it knows. You've brought clarity where there might have been only confusion. Clarity," Miss Marple mused, "is often a rather lonely reward, but one does what one must. I only hope people will remember the right lessons." The vicar nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think they ever truly do?" "Sometimes," she said, looking toward the green beyond her hedge. "When they're ready. Understanding doesn't come all at once, you know. It arrives like spring, quietly and only when the ground's been softened enough by winter." For a while they sat in companionable silence. The sun dipped lower, the sky fading into a deep, serene blue. The world around them seemed utterly ordinary again, the sound of distant laughter from the reopened inn, the clip-clop of a cart along the lane, the faint rustle of the hedgerows. Yet Miss Marple knew that within such ordinary scenes lay all the makings of tragedy and triumph alike. Human hearts were not so different from her garden, beautiful when tended, dangerous when neglected. When the vicar rose to leave, she walked him to the gate. "You'll join us for supper on Sunday, won't you?" he asked. "I shall be delighted," she said with a gentle smile, "provided no one decides to commit any sudden mischief before then." He laughed softly and tipped his hat. "Heaven forbid, Miss Marple. I think the village has learned its lesson for the year." As his figure disappeared down the path, Miss Marple lingered at the gate, the cool evening air brushing against her face. The stars were beginning to appear, faint and scattered above the rooftops. She drew her shawl tighter and allowed herself a small sigh of contentment. The Bluebellian murder was over, its roots laid bare, its shadows dispelled. But she knew, as surely as the seasons turned, that somewhere, sometime soon, another quiet corner of human nature would stir restlessly, and another truth would beckon her gentle, unerring eye. When at last she went inside and closed the door, the firelight flickered across the room, casting long, steady patterns on the walls. She set her teacup down, took up her knitting and began to work with calm precision, the needles clicking softly in the stillness. The rhythm was familiar, almost musical, a sound of peace, of patience, and of life continuing just as it always had. And outside, beyond the neat garden gate, St. Mary Mead slumbered under the tranquil gaze of the stars, unaware that its quiet guardian, with her sharp eyes and gentle heart, had once again seen the darkness and turned it quietly toward the light.